The Casino Monte Carlo of the Mediterranean had a reputation that surpassed its roulette tables and its crystal halls. Built in the 1960s with capital from European and Middle Eastern investors, the establishment had become a symbol of lucrative neutrality, a territory where rival diplomats played poker at the same table, where businessmen from hostile nations negotiated contracts on expensive whiskey, where money spoke louder than flags. Henri Valmont knew every inch of that place. At the age of 43, with 15 years of service on the security team, Henri had started as a simple guard and worked his way up to night shift supervisor. He knew the behavior patterns of regular gamblers. He knew how to distinguish genuine tourists from undercover professionals. He identified signs of cheating with precision that came from thousands of hours of observing gaming tables. The night of Thursday, March 14th, 1974, began like any other. Moderate movement, about 300 customers distributed among the three main floors, with a greater concentration in the European roulette hall and the VIP lounges on the second floor. Henri made his 10 p.m. rounds, checking security checkpoints, checking cameras, making sure the night's 80 employees were in position. Everything is normal. Everything is controlled. Everything exactly as it should be. The first anomaly happened at 11:47 p.m. One of the security guards at the south gate, a young man named Marcel, hired 3 months ago, radioed that there was suspicious movement in the parking lot. Henri asked for details, but the broadcast was cut off before Marcel could respond. He tried to contact him again. Silence. Henri immediately descended to the south gate, feeling the first thread of tension that years of experience had taught him not to ignore. He found Marcel slumped behind the security counter, unconscious but breathing, apparently struck by a precise blow to the back of the head. The gate was unlocked. Before he could raise the alarm, Henri sensed presence behind him. He spun too fast, his hand instinctively going to the radio, but stopped when he saw 3 masked figures pointing automatic weapons at his chest. "Slowly," said a voice in French, with an accent that Henri could not immediately identify. "Your hands, where I can see. Radio on the floor now." Henri obeyed, years of safety training conflicting with survival instinct. He deposited the radio carefully on the floor, keeping slow and visible movements. "How many security guards in the building?" asked the same voice. 78, Henri replied, calculating whether he should lie or not. He decided for the truth. Detected lies would only make the situation worse. "Armament?" 38 caliber pistols. Only senior staff carry weapons. Floor guards have only radios and batons. The masked man waved to the other 2, who immediately began to move with military precision. Henri recognized professional coordination. They were not ordinary criminals looking for quick robbery. They were something much more dangerous. "You will help us," said the leader. "If you cooperate, no one needs to die. If you resist, we turn it into a massacre. Understood?" Henri nodded, his mind already working at top speed, cataloging details. 3 men at this gate, heavy weaponry. Communication by hand signals suggesting that they would have more teams in other positions. Coordinated operation, multiple simultaneous entry points. As he was escorted back inside the casino, Henri saw confirmation of his suspicions. At least 12 more masked figures moved through the corridors, taking strategic positions. Some were heading to the security center on the 3rd floor. Others were positioned at the main exits. 2 entered the electrical control room. The occupation had been planned with surgical precision. In the main hall, customers were still playing, oblivious to what was happening behind the scenes. Henri watched as the kidnappers, now certain that this was what they were, waited for the exact moment. At 00:13, the lights dimmed slightly, combined signal. 10 armed men simultaneously entered the main hall through different doors. There were no shots, there were no immediate screams, only firm commands in French, English, and Arabic, ordering everyone to remain seated, hands visible, without sudden movements. The panic began gradually, first as startled murmurs, then as muffled cry, finally as the tense silence of hundreds of people realizing that they had become hostages. Henri was forced to sit down along with the other floor security guards, all of whom were preemptively disarmed, all under direct surveillance. He mentally counted 342 civilians, 80 employees, a total of 422 people now under the control of approximately 20 kidnappers. The following hours revealed the methodology of the occupants. They separated the hostages by category: VIPs, diplomats, well-known businessmen, personalities. In one room, employees in another, regular customers distributed throughout the main halls. They collected identity documents, photographed faces, took notes. Henri realized that it was not an operation motivated only by money. The care with identification, the deliberate separation of high-value targets, the absence of immediate demands, all pointed to political goals. Around 3 a.m., the leader of the kidnappers made first communication with the outside. Using the administrative office's phone, he spoke briefly, less than 2 minutes before hanging up. Henri, positioned close enough to hear fragments, picked up only sparse words. Controlled, 14 VIPs, waiting for confirmation. Outside, Henri knew security forces would already be mobilizing. The casino was in a dense urban area surrounded by hotels and residential apartments. Any rescue operation would have to consider not only the hostages inside, but also civilians in adjacent buildings. At 5:30 a.m., the first dawn lights began to illuminate the casino's windows. Henri observed the kidnappers, their movements still precise, but beginning to show signs of fatigue. Guards rotated positions every hour, but 20 men controlling more than 400 hostages in a 5-story building was challenging logistics. That's when Henri began to notice the details. One of the kidnappers had a specific mannerism. He constantly checked his watch, always the same gesture. Another maintained a position that offered line of sight to 3 doors simultaneously, never being exposed to blind spots. There was military discipline there, but also signs of planning that he had considered limited duration. They did not expect prolonged occupation. They were waiting for something, exfiltration, reinforcements, or perhaps simply political attention that would arrive in broad daylight. At 7 a.m., a news helicopter flew over the casino. Within minutes, 3 more appeared. TV cameras were positioned in adjacent buildings. The crisis that had begun in the silence of the early morning now dominated international headlines. Henri saw an expression of satisfaction on the face of the leader of the kidnappers. That was exactly what they wanted. A global stage, maximum attention, pressure on governments to negotiate. But Henri also saw something else. Behind this superficial confidence, there was growing tension. The kidnappers knew that each prolonged hour increased the risk of a rescue operation. They needed quick resolution as much as the authorities. The impasse was just beginning, and Henri Valmont, the security supervisor who knew every inch of that building, was about to become a crucial piece in a game far more complex than any of the kidnappers could have anticipated. The crisis room set up at the National Police Headquarters was 2 miles from the casino, a distance that allowed coordination without direct exposure to the security perimeter. Commander Laurent Mercier arrived at 6:15 a.m. to Pau or Canning, taking control of an operation that already mobilized 240 agents, 12 tactical units, and representatives of 6 different intelligence agencies. The initial briefing was devastating in its simplicity. Casino occupied, 422 hostages confirmed, 20 estimated kidnappers, 0 casualties to date, but extremely volatile situation. Who are they? Mercier asked, studying plans of the building projected on the entire wall of the crisis room. We still don't have positive identification, replied Captain Rousseau, head of the intelligence unit. Based on analysis of intercepted communications and operational patterns, probably a political cell with connections to the Middle East. Evident military training. They are not amateurs. Mercier nodded, his mind already working through layers of complexity that this crisis presented. The casino was in a dense urban area, surrounded by residential and commercial buildings. Any rescue operation using force would have unacceptable collateral, both inside and outside the building. Have we made contact? First communication at 7:30 a.m. They presented preliminary demands. Release of 12 political prisoners held in 3 different countries, safe transport to an unspecified destination, and guaranteed media coverage for political statement. Classic, Mercier muttered. Impossible demands that only serve to extend negotiations while they wait. What? International pressure? Third-party intervention? No one had a definitive answer. The next few hours were consumed by attempts at negotiation, long, carefully calibrated conversations where trained negotiators tried to establish rapport, buy time, identify weaknesses in the cohesion of the kidnapping group. But the kidnappers remained disciplined, and they released 4 hostages, 2 elderly people with medical conditions, 2 children, as a gesture of good faith, but they kept all the VIPs and refused any substantive concessions. At 2 p.m., Mercier received a call that would completely change the nature of the operation. He was a colonel in the Special Forces Unit, Colonel Arnaud Deschamps, commander of a unit whose existence was officially denied by the government. I have a proposal, Deschamps said without preamble. Unconventional, high risk, but possibly our best option given the environment. Mercier listened as Deschamps outlined a concept that was simultaneously obvious and audacious. Disguised infiltration using the casino's own security structure as cover. The casino has a great security team, Deschamps explained. 80 employees, constant circulation, standardized uniform. The kidnappers are already used to seeing security guards moving around the building. If we insert operators who look identical to the real employees, they would detect it immediately, Mercier interrupted. Any unfamiliar face would be noticed. Not if we have a legitimate reason for new security guards to enter. Think about it. More than 400 people confined to buildings for hours. Electrical systems under stress. Fire risk, structural problems, need for crowd management. We can argue that additional security is necessary for basic security reasons. Mercier considered the proposal, seeing both the potential and the catastrophic risks. What if they notice? if they really identify an undercover operator? So we will have the same result as we would have with conventional robbery, confrontation, but with a crucial difference. Our operators will already be positioned internally in strategic positions with real-time knowledge of the situation. We can act with surgical precision instead of brute force. The meeting that followed involved 17 people: tactical commanders, hostage crisis psychologists, construction specialists, and 3 members of the casino's senior security team who had managed to get out before the full occupation. "We need information about routines," Deschamps said, addressing the casino's experts. "How do security guards move? What kind of communication do they use? Are there specific codes, gestures, internal vocabulary?" For 4 hours, the team dissected every aspect of the casino's security operations. Uniforms were replicated with millimeter precision, not only the visible garments, but also details such as ID badges, specific radio equipment, even the wear marks on belts and holsters that distinguished veterans from rookies. Psychologists studied the behavior of the kidnappers through images from external cameras and accounts of the 4 freed hostages. The conclusion was unsettling. After more than 12 hours of continuous tension, the kidnappers were fatigued but dangerously hyper-alert. Any anomaly would potentially be detected. "We need additional fatigue," said Dr. Helena Moreau, lead psychologist. "Keeping them awake, increasing cognitive stress through prolonged negotiations, forcing them to make constant decisions. When they finally accept the entry of the additional security guards, we want them to be in a state where information processing is compromised." The trading strategy has been adjusted. Negotiators began to extend talks, come up with complex proposals that required internal discussion among the hijackers, create a sense of progress without ever actually conceding anything substantive. It worked. By 6 p.m., nearly 18 hours into the occupation, the kidnappers showed visible signs of exhaustion. Their communications became shorter, angrier. 2 were seen briefly napping in their positions. That was when Mercier made the formal proposal. "We are concerned about structural safety. 400 people confined is beyond the capacity of managing the ventilation and electrical system. We need to insert additional security personnel, unarmed, under their full supervision, to prevent problems that would harm everyone." The internal discussion between the kidnappers lasted 40 minutes. Through directional microphones, Mercier's team listened to fragments of the debate, some wanting to refuse altogether, others arguing that the risk of fire or structural collapse was real and would undermine their negotiating position. Finally, the leader accepted, with strict conditions. 6 security guards, no more, no long guns, searched at the entrance. They will remain under direct observation at all times. Any suspicious movement, and we start executing hostages. Mercier accepted the terms, knowing that 6 well-placed operators were sufficient if coordination was perfect. The selection of operators was meticulous. Not only tactical skill mattered, they needed individuals who could perform under extreme pressure while maintaining the appearance of ordinary security personnel. Men who could spend hours under hostile surveillance without showing military training. Deschamps personally chose Lieutenant Moreau, hand-to-hand combat specialist, Sergeant Dubois, infiltration expert, Corporal Laurent, demolition and electrical systems training, plus 3 operators with experience in complex urban operations. Each spent 3 hours in intensive preparation, not only memorizing the casino's layout, but internalizing the behavior of real security guards, how they walked, how they held radios, how they interacted with colleagues. They watched hours of security camera footage, studying specific mannerisms. At 9 p.m., they were ready, uniforms identical to those of the real team, weapons hidden in almost undetectable internal holsters, cloned communication equipment transmitting on frequencies that the kidnappers monitored, but also on an encrypted channel that only the outside team heard. The entrance was theatrical in its normality. The 6 security guards arrived in a van from the casino security company, got off with the tired posture of employees on extra shifts, were meticulously searched by the kidnappers. Moreau, playing shift supervisor, kept a bored expression as the kidnapper passed a metal detector over his body. The compact gun in specially designed holster did not register. The kidnapper found only a radio, flashlight, skeleton keys. Exactly what he expected to find. "You will work under direct supervision," the leader of the kidnappers said in rugged French. "Any area they need to access, they will ask for permission first. Understood?" "Understood," Moreau replied with exactly the tone of angry resignation that the royal employee would have. And so, 6 of the country's deadliest operators entered the occupied casino disguised as ordinary workers, beginning the most dangerous phase of an operation that would be studied for decades as an example of tactical deception in an active civilian setting. Henri Valmont, still sitting among the hostages in the main hall, saw the new security guards enter. And I immediately knew that something was different. Something was about to happen. Henri Valmont had seen thousands of security guards over 15 years. I knew the type: ex-military or police officers looking for quieter work, young people in need of stable employment, genuine security professionals building careers. Each category had specific mannerisms, ways of walking, ways of holding equipment. The 6 men who entered at 9 p.m. did not fit neatly into any category. On the surface, they seemed correct. Uniforms identical to those of the royal team, appropriate badges, standard equipment. But there was something about the economy of movement, too subtle a precision, a constant spatial awareness that went beyond normal safety training. Henri watched discreetly as what appeared to be the group's supervisor, a man in his 40s with a thinly disguised military posture, talked to the leader of the kidnappers. The interaction was perfect: appropriate tone of voice, body language of a tired employee working extra shift, even the restrained irritation appropriate for someone forced to work under abnormal conditions. But the eyes were constantly evaluating, measuring distances, identifying angles of coverage and routes of movement. Henri was sure these were no ordinary security guards, which meant that something was about to happen. Lieutenant Moreau, playing the overseer Jacques Fontaine on his fake badge, moved through the main hall with careful deliberation. Each step seemed routine: checking emergency exits, examining electrical panels, simulating inspection of ventilation systems. But each move also positioned him strategically. Through the almost invisible micro-auricular, he heard constant coordination from the external team. Alpha 1, 2 hostiles in the East Corridor, level 2. Alpha 2, do you have clean line of sight to the kidnapper next to the vault? Alpha 2 confirmed, replied Sergeant Dubois, disguised as a maintenance technician checking wiring in a closet near the vault room. Distance of 7 meters, minimal obstruction. The 6 operators spent the next 2 hours in a carefully choreographed ballet, moving in a way that seemed random but gradually positioned them close to the critical points identified in the planning. The main hall, where most of the hostages were concentrated, the corridor leading to the vault where 3 kidnappers stood guard, the electrical control room, and the industrial kitchen that offered a secondary exfiltration route. The fatigue of the kidnappers became more and more evident. After 24 hours of continuous tension, his discipline began to crack. 2 were seen arguing in low tones, apparently over negotiation strategy. Another dozed off in a sitting position, waking up with a startle when his partner nudged him. Moreau noticed all these details, transmitting them discreetly. In the external command center, Deschamps and Mercier built a real-time model of the internal situation, updating positions, alert states, windows of opportunity. Well, we've got a problem. Mercier's voice came through the headset at 11:17 p.m. Analysis of intercepted communications suggests that the hijackers are growing impatient. They mentioned speeding up timeline and demonstration of seriousness. The interpretation is that they may be considering executing a hostage to force concessions. Moreau felt adrenaline, but kept a neutral expression as he pretended to adjust the thermostat on the wall. Action window? Psychologists estimate that we have between 1 and 3 hours before potential escalation. The recommendation is to start when all operators are in an optimal position. The problem was that optimal positioning required each of the 6 operators to be simultaneously within 5 meters of their designated targets, with adequate cover, no hostages in the line of fire, and no hijacker noticing the positioning pattern. It was a 3-dimensional puzzle that changed constantly. Henri saw when it happened, the moment when the operation almost fell apart. One of the new security guards, the youngest, no more than 25 years old, was checking a fire extinguisher near the main bar. Perfectly normal routine, except that the leader of the kidnappers, passing through the corridor at that moment, stopped. He noted. He studied the young man for a time that seemed like eternity. Henri saw the kidnapper frown, step towards the undercover operator. The operator's radio chose exactly that moment to emit loud static. Technical failure, random interference, but perfectly timed to look suspicious. The silence that followed lasted less than 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, Henri saw the operator do something remarkable. He didn't freeze. He didn't react defensively. He simply slammed the radio with genuine irritation from someone who constantly deals with faulty equipment, muttered something that sounded like "crap always breaks at the worst time," and continued his inspection of the extinguisher. The leader of the kidnappers hesitated. His eyes scanned the uniform, the badge, the movements of the young man, looking for anomalies, inconsistencies, any sign that this was not a legitimate employee. Henri held his breath. Finally, the kidnapper turned and continued his round. But the tension remained, subtle, almost imperceptible, but present. "We had potential exposure," Moreau quietly conveyed. "Level of suspicion unknown. Recommend speeding up timeline." At the command center, Deschamps made a decision that would define not only this operation but future rescue protocols in similar crises. All operators, start final positioning. 15-minute window of action, confirm when in position. The next 15 minutes were the most tense of the career of each operator involved. They moved with deliberation that seemed casual. Moreau checking electrical panel that casually placed him 4 meters from 2 kidnappers in the main hall. Dubois inspecting a non-existent leak that positioned him perfectly to neutralize safeguards. 4 others distributing themselves in precise geometry. Henri watched everything, his own adrenaline increasing as he recognized the pattern. They were preparing for something, some coordinated action. And when it did, it would be fast and probably violent. He began to position himself subtly, moving in ways that looked like nervous restlessness, but actually pulled him away from potential lines of fire. Other hostages, noticing the movement, began to instinctively imitate it, a primitive response to danger signals that the brain detects before consciousness recognizes it. At 23:42, Moreau received final confirmation. All operators in position, waiting for a sign of execution. Deschamps, watching through drone and thermal cameras that mapped the casino's interior, saw the window. A brief but crucial moment where the configuration of kidnappers, hostages, and operators created geometry that would allow simultaneous action with minimal collateral risk. "Attention, all operators." His voice came clear over the encrypted channel. "Execution on my brand. 3, 2. That's when Henri saw the leader of the kidnappers spin abruptly, his eyes fixed on Moreau with suspicion that had finally crystallized into certainty. The kidnapper's hand moved to the gun, mouth opening to shout alert. Execute! 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 What happened in the next 17 seconds would be analyzed in slow motion by experts in rescue tactics for the next 20 years. The 6 operators moved simultaneously, instantly transforming from bored employees into coordinated lethal force. Guns emerged from hidden holsters. Movements became explosive in speed and precision. Moreau covered the 4 meters to his targets before they could fully process what was happening. There were no shots, precise strikes at neural pressure points, disarming by hand-to-hand combat techniques trained through thousands of repetitions. Dubois neutralized the vault guards with clinical efficiency. One received a knee that cut consciousness instantly. Another was immobilized by strangulation that induced fainting in seconds without permanent damage. Around the casino, a similar scene was repeated in 6 different locations, operators emerging in disguise to neutralize kidnappers before they could react, reach improvised devices, or threaten hostages. The kidnappers' training, while genuine, had not prepared for this. They expected a frontal assault, doors exploding, a dramatic confrontation. They did not expect that the enemy was already inside, disguised as part of the landscape. Within 17 seconds, 14 of the 20 kidnappers were neutralized. The remaining 6, in more distant positions, or simply more alert, were able to react. Weapons were raised, screams echoed. Hostages dove for cover as years of survival instinct took over. And that's when the second phase of the operation began. External tactical teams, waiting for a signal, exploded through multiple entry points simultaneously. The casino, which for 24 hours had been a zone of silent tension, exploded into controlled but absolute chaos. The sound Henri Valmont would never forget wasn't gunfire or explosions. It was the simultaneous rumble of 4 doors being broken into, followed by the coordinated cry of "Police!" to the ground, "Hands on head!" in French, English, and Arabic. The tactical teams entered like a force of nature. 12 men for each access point, fluid and lethal movement, occupying space with speed that made resistance nearly impossible. Flashbangs detonated in strategic areas, not to blind or disorient hostages, but to create critical seconds of confusion among the remaining hijackers. Henri was on the ground before he consciously decided to move, arms covering his head, body making himself smaller. Around him, 300 hostages did the same, survival instinct nullifying rational thought. The confrontation was brief but intense. The 6 hijackers who had managed to react to the first wave of neutralizations found themselves instantly outnumbered. 3 surrendered immediately, dropping weapons and raising hands when they saw the magnitude of the force surrounding them. 2 tried to resist. One was knocked down by a non-lethal precision bullet that hit his shoulder, causing the gun to fall. The other was neutralized by tear gas grenades that forced him to abandon position. The last kidnapper, the leader, Henri acknowledged, briefly barricaded himself in the control room with 2 hostages. It was a situation that could have lasted for hours in a dangerous standoff, but the undercover operators had already mapped every inch of that space. Moreau, still in security uniform, but now with a gun in hand and tactical identification on his chest, coordinated an approach through a ventilation duct that none of the kidnappers knew existed. 2 traitors entered through the ceiling while the negotiator kept the leader distracted through the door. The neutralization took 8 seconds. The leader was disarmed before he could react. The 2 hostages pulled to safety. And the last hijacker immobilized with handcuffs and a hood before he could fully process what had happened. From the start of the execution order to complete control of the casino, 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Henri stood up slowly as voices began to shout, "Clean! Safe area!" repeatedly. Around him, the casino looked like a war zone, furniture knocked over, glass broken from flashbangs, 20 men handcuffed and pinned to the ground under surveillance by tactical operators. But not a single hostage had been seriously injured. Some treated for shock, some with scratches from having thrown themselves on the ground in a hurry, but all alive, all safe. The next few hours were methodical processing, hostages being identified, interviewed briefly, examined by paramedics. VIPs were discreetly escorted to secondary exits where vehicles awaited them, avoiding the media circus that was already brewing outside. Henri was one of the last to leave. Commander Mercier personally came to speak with him. "Mr. Valmont," Mercier said, holding out his hand, "your colleagues told us that you know this building better than anyone. Their information about layout and routines was crucial for the planning." Henri shook his hand, still processing everything he had witnessed. "The men who entered, disguised as security guards, I knew there was something different about them." His instinct was correct. Mercier smiled slightly. "Lieutenant Moreau and his team are the best at what they do. What you witnessed today will change how rescue operations are conducted going forward. They risked everything by infiltrating like that. If they had been discovered before their time, it would have been catastrophe." Mercier agreed. "But that's the nature of special operations. Calculated risk against worse alternatives. Frontal assault would have resulted in casualties. Prolonged waits could have led kidnappers to execute hostages. Infiltration offered the best balance between risk and effectiveness." Henri was released at 4:30 a.m. Nearly 29 hours after the crisis began, he exited through the service entrance, avoiding cameras, and found his wife waiting in the family reunification area. The hug lasted a long time. Neither of them said anything. There were no words adequate for what he had experienced or the relief she felt when she saw him alive. In the following days, the operation dominated international headlines. Security experts looked at every aspect: the undercover infiltration, the precise coordination, the use of psychology to exploit kidnappers' fatigue. Some criticized risk. Others celebrated innovation. But for militant organizations monitoring the coverage, the message was clear. Not even environments full of civilians, not even situations where hostages offered protection were safer. New tactics had been demonstrated. Vulnerabilities not previously considered were exposed. The casino itself reopened 6 weeks later after extensive renovations and a complete upgrade of the security system. Henri returned to work, this time as director of security, promoted in recognition of his conduct during the crisis. But something had changed. Each time he saw a new member of the security team, Henri found himself studying movements, looking for signs of training beyond the normal. An inside joke arose among the veterans. Is this a real security guard or an undercover operator? 3 months after the operation, Henri received an unexpected visit. Lieutenant Moreau, now Captain Moreau, promoted after the success of the mission, appeared at the casino in civilian, asking to speak privately. They met in Henri's office, behind closed doors. "I came to thank you personally," Moreau said. "During those hours inside, his presence helped. I saw how you were discreetly positioning other hostages away from potential lines of fire, how you kept calm that prevented panic." Henri wasn't sure if it had been as deliberate as Moreau suggested, but he didn't argue. "You risked your lives by entering like that. It was impressive. It's terrifying. It was necessary." Moreau leaned back in his chair. "Well, we learned a lot from this operation. What worked? What could have been better? Each mission informs the next. Will there be a next one?" "There always is. Kidnappers, terrorists, they adapt tactics. We adapted counter-tactics. It's an infinite cycle." Moreau paused. "But every success like this saves lives. Every operation that ends with all the hostages safe justifies the risks we take." They talked for another hour, Moreau sharing details that had not been publicly disclosed, Henri asking questions about aspects of the operation that he had observed but not fully understood. When Moreau finally got up to leave, he reached out again. "If we ever need consulting on operations in complex civilian environments, can I contact you?" Henri considered the offer. Part of him wanted to say no. He wanted to leave that experience in the past, but more recognized the value of contributing to life-saving systems. "Yes," he said finally. "You can contact me." Years later, when Henri eventually retired from the casino, he accepted an advisory position with a special forces unit, teaching operators about the dynamics of civilian environments, crowd behavior under stress, and how to detect anomalies in spaces he monitored professionally. The operation at the Mediterranean's Monte Carlo casino became a case study in military academies, an example of how tactical deception, deep knowledge of the environment, and precise coordination could resolve crises that seemed unsolvable. But for Henri, for the hostages who survived, and for the operators who risked everything disguised as ordinary employees, it was not an abstract case study. It was a vivid memory of the night, when normalcy had become a weapon, where invisible protectors were among them all the time, where the line between safety and danger was as thin as the difference between identical uniforms, and where, in the end, patient method prevailed over brute violence, proving that sometimes the most important victory is not about how fast you can strike, but about how perfectly you can hide in plain sight until the exact moment is reached. 10 years after the operation at the Monte Carlo Casino of the Mediterranean, Captain Moreau, now Major Moreau, was speaking at an international conference on counterterrorism tactics when a question from the audience paused. "The casino operation is often cited as an example of perfect tactical deception," said the German officer who had raised his hand, "but there was a time when it was almost discovered, correct? When did the radio fail?" Moreau smiled, a smile that carried a memory of tension that never completely disappears. "There were several moments. Radio was just the most obvious. Every second of those hours inside the casino was an exercise in absolute control, not just of actions, but of micro-expressions, body posture, even breathing patterns." He clicked to next slide, showing tactical diagram of the casino with kidnapper and operator positions mapped. What makes this operation interesting is not that it was perfect. It wasn't. It has demonstrated a fundamental principle. In complex civilian environments, violence applied with surgical precision overcomes overwhelming brute force. The conference was part of a broader shift in counterterrorism doctrine. The casino operation had proven that undercover infiltration was feasible even under constant hostile surveillance. In the following years, variations of the technique were applied in hostage crises in embassies, schools, and even on hijacked planes where operators infiltrated disguised as cleaning crews. Not all of them were successful. There have been operations where disguise was detected prematurely, resulting in prolonged standoffs. But the success rate, 63% in 42 documented operations, was significantly higher than conventional robberies. Henri Valmont, watching the same lecture via live broadcast from his advisory office, was thinking about that night's legacy. He now trained security teams at high-value venues, casinos, luxury hotels, convention centers, on how to identify vulnerabilities that kidnappers could exploit, but also how to recognize signs of ongoing rescue operations. The paradox, he often said in his own lectures, is that the best rescue operations are those which appear completely normal up to the very moment of execution. If you can detect them early, they weren't well planned. The private security industry had evolved dramatically. Protocols developed after the casino's operation became standard. Biometric identification systems for employees, random verification routines, radio codes that changed daily, even behavior analysis through artificial intelligence that identified anomalous patterns. But every security measure created new vulnerability. Each system had a blind spot. And operators like those who had rescued Henri were specifically trained to find and exploit these blind spots. It was an infinite cycle of measure and countermeasure, tactics and countertactics. 5 years after the operation, the kidnappers themselves, those who survived and were tried, became the subject of study. Psychological interviews revealed that none of them had suspected the infiltration until the time of the execution. The leader, in particular, insisted that he had felt something wrong, but had not been able to pinpoint specifically what. "The human mind is bad at detecting anomalies when context seems correct," explained Dr. Helena Moreau, the psychologist who had assisted in the original planning. "The uniforms were perfect, the behavior was appropriate, the justification for attendance was logical. When all these elements align, the brain automatically categorizes the situation as normal, even when instinct suggests caution." This understanding of cognitive psychology became a crucial tool in subsequent operations. It wasn't enough to appear legitimate. It was necessary to create a complete narrative that satisfied both conscious observation and subconscious information processing. Technology has also evolved. Equipment that Moreau and his team had used, hidden holsters, cloned radios, encrypted communication systems, seemed primitive compared to what modern operators had access to. Non-lethal weapons with millimeter accuracy, miniaturized surveillance systems, even exoskeletons that allowed superhuman strength while maintaining a normal appearance under clothing. But the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Success depended less on equipment and more on the human ability to perform under extreme pressure, maintain perfect disguise, and execute with absolute precision at the critical moment. Henri met with Moreau occasionally over the years, informal meetings where they exchanged perspectives on how security and special operations continued to evolve. In one such encounter, 3 years after the operation, Moreau shared statistics that Henri found both comforting and disturbing. Since the casino operation, Moreau said, There have been 17 hostage crises in civilian settings where undercover infiltration has been considered. We executed in 7 cases. In all 7, we achieved resolution with no hostage casualties. Of the 10 where we chose not to infiltrate, 3 ended up with dead hostages. Henri crunched the numbers. So the technique saves lives, but it only works when circumstances are exactly right. Precisely. And determining when circumstances are right requires judgment that goes beyond any algorithm or protocol. Moreau paused. That's why your work is so important. The better we understand civilian environments, the better our decisions about when and how to intervene. Years later, when Henri finally retired completely, now 62, 28 years after that night at the casino, he wrote a book about his experiences. Not a dramatic memoir focused on personal emotions, but technical analysis of security in high-value environments, terrorism, and rescue operations. The chapter on the operation of the casino has become required reading in multiple training courses for both security professionals and special forces operators. Moreau, who eventually reached the rank of colonel before retiring, wrote a foreword to Henri's book. In it, he captured the essence of what that night had represented. Military operations are often judged by simple metrics: objectives achieved, enemies neutralized, territory controlled. But true test of operational excellence is achieving objectives while minimizing collateral damage, protecting innocents, and resolving crises in the least violent way possible. The operation of the Casino Monte Carlo of the Mediterranean represents ideal: complete victory without loss of innocent lives, decisive resolution through patient deception rather than brute force. It is a model not because it was perfect, but because it demonstrated that there is always an alternative to maximum violence if we have the skill, patience, and courage to pursue it. 30 years after the operation, the Casino Monte Carlo of the Mediterranean was still operating, now under a new name after multiple changes of ownership, but in the same building, serving the same function of neutral territory where power and money converged. An inconspicuous sign in the lobby, installed on the 25th anniversary of the operation, simply read, "In memory of the events of March 1974, when courage and professionalism prevailed over violence." Few of the current visitors knew the full story. For them, it was just historical curiosity, a reference to something that happened a long time ago. But for those who were there, for Henri, for Moreau, for the hostages who survived and the operators who risked everything, it was not ancient history. It was a vivid reminder of a night when the line between normalcy and crisis was as thin as the difference between real security guards and undercover operators. It was proof that sometimes the most important victories are those where violence is avoided, not inflicted, where intelligence trumps strength, where strategic patience defeats impulsive action, and where true heroes are those who save lives while remaining invisible until the exact moment they need to reveal themselves. The lesson remained relevant decades later. In an increasingly complex world where threats masquerading as normalcy and security depended on constant vigilance, the ability to see through appearances and act with surgical precision at the critical moment was not just tactical skill. It was art that could mean the difference between tragedy and salvation.